Okay, so this is Unit 6, Lesson 5, where we're continuing on with measures of central tendency, except this time we are applying them to grouped frequency tables. So the goal here is to calculate mean, median, and mode from data and from grouped frequency tables. So when we're working with grouped data, we have to consider some of these measures of central tendency a little bit differently. So the modal class, it's not just the mode now because it's an interval as opposed to a single value, will be the group or class that has the largest frequency. So that's not too terribly different from what we usually do. The mean in a grouped frequency table isn't going to be an exact value. It's just going to be an estimate. And we take the total of the values where we multiply the frequency by the midpoint instead of by a value, because of course we don't have specific values. And that's true when the midpoint is the average of the lower and upper boundaries. So if we look at an example, we can sort of see how this works. So here's an example where we have the time in seconds that it takes to complete 200 bouts of sumo wrestling. So 200 individual bouts that are timed, and here's a table showing the time intervals and the frequency, so how many bouts fell into each of those time intervals. So we'll find the modal class and an estimate for the mean. So the modal class is the class that has the greatest frequency. So in this case, the highest frequency is 62, and that happens for the modal class of 20 to 40 seconds. And you'd communicate it just like that. You'd write down the interval for that modal class. To find the mean, the easiest approach is to add a few columns to your table. So we're going to add 2 columns. The first column is going to represent the midpoints of our intervals. So when you have a grouped frequency table, you don't actually know any of the specific values for your data. So for example, I just know there are 37 bouts of sumo wrestling that took between 0 and 20 seconds. I have no idea what the actual times of those 37 bouts were. So I can't add together all of the values because I don't know what the values are when I'm trying to calculate the mean or the average. So what we do instead is we identify the midpoints of each of the intervals, and we call that x. And so it's going to be 10, 30, and so on. And so when we're finding the midpoints, so that'll be 50, 70, 90, 110, 130, 150. That allows us to assign values to each of the frequencies. So this is why the mean of a grouped frequency situation is always an estimate, because we're now assuming that all 37 of these bouts between 0 and 20 seconds lasted for 10 seconds. That is clearly not going to be the case. So we're making an assumption and we're making our best estimate of the data using the midpoint, which is why the mean is only going to be an approximate value. So what we're going to do then is we're going to take the frequency values and multiply them by the midpoint values. And this would be kind of like what we did in frequency tables earlier, where we are making our way towards calculating the sum of all the values. So if we have 37 bouts, all of which lasted 10 seconds, then if we added those all together, we'd get 370. And then we're going to carry on with all the other combinations. So 62 times 30, 46 times 50, which is 2300, 25 times 70, 11 times 90, 9 times 110, which is going to be the same thing, 6 times 130, and 4 4 times 150 should be 600. And then we're going to add up all of those sums. So again, this is if we had a list, we'd have 37 tens, then we'd have 62 30s. So this is a shorter way of adding up all those values without having to write out the list, because there are 200 numbers and that would take quite a long time. So now we're going to add all of these up to find the sum, which we need to calculate the mean. So 2300, 1750, 990, another 990, 780, and 600. And so that ends up to be 9640. So our mean estimate will be approximately equal to 9640 divided by 200. And so if we do that calculation, we get approximately 48.2 seconds. So again, this is only an estimate because we decided that we'd assign a midpoint value to all of our frequencies. So that's how you would calculate the mean by hand. So you'd add these columns to your table, identify the interval midpoints, multiply those midpoints by the frequencies, and add all those products and divide by the total frequency. So let's try another example just to practice. So this table shows the reaction times of 50 children who were catching a ruler. So we've got the reaction time in seconds and the frequency listed in the right-hand column. So the modal class is going to be the most frequent, which is the frequency of 15, which is between 3 and 4 seconds. And so for the mean, again, we're going to add 2 columns to our table. One for the midpoint and one for the products of the midpoints and the frequencies. So our midpoints here are going to have decimal values. So our midpoints are the xi values, and then we're going to multiply frequency by midpoint. So we have 0.5, 1.5, etc. All of these as the halfway points of the intervals. And then we'd find the product. So 0.5 times 3 is 1.5. 10 times 1.5 is 15. 14 times 2.5 is 35. 15 times 3.5 is 52 and a half. 4 times 4.5 is 18. 2 times 5.5 should be 11. 1 of 6.5 and 1 of 7.5. And then we tally those up. So the total there is going to be the sum of all of those values. 35, 52.5, 18, 11, 6.5, and 7.5. And when we add all those up, we get 147, and our total frequency is 50, because we're told in the question that it's 50 children, so our mean estimate is going to be 147 divided by 50, which is approximately 2.94 seconds. So even though that works out to an exact answer, I'm still using the approximately equal to notation because it's still an estimate. This is not an exact mean because I assigned midpoint values to each of the frequencies. So just like with the last video, we can also do this on the calculator. So here's an example where we will use the calculator to analyze a grouped frequency table. Now this one has a nice little spin because we're given a histogram and we have to create the frequency table. So the modal class, first of all, we can do anyway. That's the highest frequency, so the highest bar on the histogram, and that goes from 24 to 28 years of age. So to find the mean, it's going to be really helpful to have a frequency table. So we're just going to make a frequency table, and we're not going to do all the calculations by hand. So this is just going to be a really simple table with interval and frequency. So this is going to be age in years, and this is going to be frequency. So the first interval goes from 16 to 20. And that is going to be a frequency of, looks like 3. The next interval goes from 20 to 24. So we should probably put these as proper intervals. So 16, we'll call it A for age, 20 to 24, and that has a frequency of 12. 24 to 28, our intervals appear to be 4 wide. 28 to 32, 32 to 36, and 36 to 40. Okay, so 24 to 28 looks like about 15. Oops, sorry, 24 to 28 is about 22, and then 15. 32 to 36, I would say, is 7, and then 35 or 36 to 40 is 1. So I'm just going to make sure these add up to 60. So 3 plus 12 plus 22 plus 15 plus 7 plus 1. So that makes me feel confident that I read the frequencies right off the histogram. And now we're going to use the GDC to find this mean estimate. So in this case, we do the same thing to enter our data, stat edit. We're going to clear the old lists. And because we have intervals, we can't type intervals into the calculator. So instead, we're going to enter the midpoints of the intervals in L1. So 18, 22, 26, 30, 34, and 38. So just like in the earlier example where we identified midpoints to calculate the mean, we are using midpoints in the calculator to find an estimate for the mean as well. L2 is going to be your frequency, 15, 7, and 1. And again, we're going to go to stat. We're going to go over to calc for our one variable statistics. Our midpoints are in L1, our frequencies are in L2, so that's correct. And we go to calculate, and we see the first entry is an estimate of our mean, which is approximately 26.9 years of age. So either way, whether you're doing it by hand or on the calculator, when you're dealing with grouped frequency tables, you need to use midpoints to help you identify an estimate for the mean. So hopefully you feel comfortable finding measures of central tendency for grouped frequency tables. Those will typically just be modal class and an estimate of the mean, because you can't find a median for a grouped frequency table since we don't actually have data values. So hopefully you feel comfortable tackling the homework, and the next lesson will be on cumulative frequency curves.